Hi, 11s and 12s. So this is just the last part of the first week of cellular biology, which we're going to be looking at cell differentiation and stem cells. We're going into some ethics of stem cells as well as looking at just what cell differentiation is in itself. So going straight into the content. So we've discussed in a previous video that multicellular organisms have their cells specialized so that each different type of cell can perform a specific function and make the overall organism more efficient. What might be interesting to actually make sure what you need to know at that point is that just because you've got a different type of cell in your body, so for example your heart cells, your sperm cells, your muscle cells, sex cells, etc., although they are very different from what their function is in the body, they all have exactly the same genetic information. They have exactly the same set of genes as every other cell in your body. What happens, though, is not every gene is expressed or turned on, for lack of a better word, at the same time. So, for example, if you're looking at a muscle cell, it's probably going to have genes turned on to have a higher level of cellular respiration to create more energy because your muscles are constantly moving. Whereas if you're looking at a nerve cell, it's going to have genes that are turned on to help transmit messages throughout the body. Now, transmitting messages is not really going to be required for the muscles, so those genes would not be turned on or expressed in the muscle cells. Whereas nerves maybe don't need to generate as much energy, so they don't have as many genes turned on for cellular respiration. So different genes will have different information. Different cells will have different genes expressed at different times. When a gene is being used in a cell, that's when we say that that gene is expressed. And when a gene is expressed, that information, that gene is used to create proteins, and those proteins help perform the function that is required. That means that in order for cell differentiation to occur, we need to control gene expression, which is sort of how stem cells work. So stem cells are basically, they're unspecialized cells, and they have two key qualities that make them so important in science. First is that they have self-renewal, and that means they can continuously divide and replicate and make more copies of themselves. The second feature that they have is potency. So they have the capacity to differentiate into specialized cell types. Now, not all stem cells are equal, and they all have different levels of potency. So, for example, there's 4 main types of stem cells that you need to know. There's totipotent, which can form any cell type. They can form extraembryonic placental tissue, so zygotes, etc. Then you have pluripotent cells. They can form any cell type, but not the embryonic. Then there's multipotent. They can differentiate into a number of closely related cell types. And then you have unipotent, and they can't differentiate, but they can self-renew themselves. So talking about stem cells in the muscles, etc. Now, stem cells they're really debated quite heavily in science, but the truth is they're really important to biology. One, because they can divide again and again, and their self-renewal is so high, they can produce large amounts of new cells. This means they can be used for growth of tissues or the replacement of cells that have been lost or damaged. Not all cell systems, like I said, are fully differentiated, and you can differentiate them in different ways to produce different types of cells. We could use them to produce large quantities of meat for human consumption. One of the big issues that people talk about, and we'll talk about this a little bit in the next slide, is stem cells have this thing that people think, stem cells, they must have been taken from embryos or from child at birth, etc. But adults still technically have stem cells in their body. So, for example, you can find some in bone marrow, in your skin, in your liver, and those ones, they're going to be your multipotent, unipotent type of stem cells that we can use not as efficiently as we can use totipotent and pluripotent stem cells, but they're still useful to science because they can help provide answers. And that leads a little bit more into the ethics of stem cell research. Like I said before, this has been very controversial. There's lots of ethical objections that have been raised throughout the study of stem cells, and that's, like I said before, due to the sources that those stem cells are obtained from. And generally, those ethical objections, they do show a misunderstanding of the sources. So, concerns are raised from the fact that embryonic stem cells are taken, it usually results in the death of the embryo. And then there's the debate of whether this embryo is a living human at that point. When does a human life begin? So, look, that's one we can't dispute, and different religions and different belief systems They all have a different definition of when human life begins. Same with science. There is differences in the way when human life begins. So taking embryonic stem cells from an embryo that's basically dying because you're taking their stem cells, there's that debate of, is it ethical to do that? But stem cells can be obtained from embryo, like I said, but that's not the only place. You can also get them from the umbilical cord of a newborn baby. Many private hospitals in Adelaide will do that. Once you've had you're given birth to a child, they'll say, do you want us to store the umbilical cord and those stem cells in case you need them at a later date? And they charge a large sum for that because it's storing something that may never need to be used. But you can store stem cells from that way. But the same thing, we can remove them from adult bone marrow. They all have different properties depending on where they're removed from, but it doesn't have to always be embryonic stem cells. So the research for stem cells can continue. It just doesn't have to be from an embryo. So that's the main thing that people say, well, we can't research stem cells, it's not ethical, you can't, an embryo has died for this, but that isn't the only place that stem cells come from. And the research can still go on. Yeah, we do have to consider the belief system of when does a life begin. Is it respectful to take those embryonic stem cells at those points? But if we're looking at the other sources of stem cells, is that research ethical to do? And look, this is a question, like, if we're in class, we can debate this a lot more, and we will debate this in class a lot more, but it's worth considering these points. The last one is looking at stem cell therapy. So stem cells are important for science because we can replace damaged or diseased cells with healthy functioning ones. The way we do this is we use biochemical solutions to trigger those stem cells to differentiate into the desired cell type we need. They're then surgically implanted into the patient's tissue, and the host's immune system is basically suppressed to prevent the body rejecting those stem cells. That's if they're coming from a foreign source. If, like, for example, I said before, you're someone that's had the umbilical cord kept and you're using your own stem cells, then your host immune system is not going to kill it off because it recognizes those stem cells as coming from you. It's a whole self versus non-self thing that we'll discuss in later videos. But once that's done and the host immune system being suppressed, there's carefully monitoring of those new cells to ensure they don't become cancerous, continually divide, because remember, all cancer is basically uncontrolled cell division, and stem cells, they have that self-renewability where they can divide over and over again, so you need to make sure that that's not the case. Stem cell therapy is actually used in 2 different diseases. Both of those are on the right hand there. I'm not going to go through them in this video, but feel free to read them. Please take notes on them as well. Pause the video and take notes there. That's the end of this first week's of content.